Columbia, South Carolina, summer of 2002. The days were long, heavy with southern heat, the kind that made the air feel thick and unmoving. In the suburbs just outside the city, life followed a familiar rhythm. Sprinklers turning over trimmed lawns, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance, and the hum of cicadas filling the silence between conversations. On those quiet streets, routines held everything together. Families moved through the season without urgency. Teenagers rode their bikes between houses. Parents stood on porches in the evening, watching the sky change color as the day came to a close. Nothing about the neighborhood felt dangerous. It was the kind of place where trust was built in the spaces between mailboxes and driveways. Kara Robinson lived in that calm. She was 15, steady-eyed, serious when she needed to be, but quick to smile around people she trusted. Her life didn't make headlines. It moved in small, deliberate ways. She lived with her mother and stepfather in a modest home. Her room had photos pinned to the wall, books stacked in quiet piles, and a desk where she sometimes wrote down her thoughts, private and unshared. People who knew her said Kara had an old soul. She wasn't naive, but she hadn't lost her trust in the world either. She was independent in a way that most teenagers weren't yet required to be. Mature, reliable, and quiet in her confidence. She liked things in order. She liked knowing what was coming next. That summer, Kara had begun spending more time outside the house, helping with small chores, seeing friends, and slowly feeling the pull of independence. She wasn't reckless. She didn't chase trouble. She was the kind of teenager who checked in, who made plans, who kept her word. On the morning of June 24th, she left the house with a plan so simple it didn't even require explanation. She was going to her best friend's house. A short bike ride, a routine visit, the kind of summer errand that goes unnoticed 1,000 times in neighborhoods like this. Before she left, her mother asked her to water the plants. Kara agreed without hesitation. It was a small thing, just another part of the day. There was no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. No reason at all. She pedaled toward her friend's house, moving with that teenage combination of freedom and familiarity. The roads were quiet. The sun was already warming the pavement. It was still early enough that the world hadn't quite shifted into the full hum of day. Outside her friend's house, she propped her bike up and walked toward the driveway. Her thoughts, by all accounts, were ordinary. She was likely thinking about the rest of the day. Maybe about music. Maybe about what she and her friend would talk about when she got inside. And then he appeared. A man, mid-30s, calm voice, clean appearance, someone who didn't seem out of place. He held a handful of pamphlets, said they were religious materials, said he was going door to door. He smiled. He was polite. Would she take one? He said the others were in his car. He'd get one for her. It would only take a second. Kara watched him turn toward the vehicle, a green Pontiac Firebird, parked just a few feet away. He opened the door, leaned inside, then gestured to her. "Here," he said. "You can grab it." And she stepped forward. She never even saw the gun, only felt it. Suddenly he was close. The barrel pressed to her neck. The words low and firm. "Get in the car." He forced her into a large plastic storage container in the back seat. One of those wide-lidded bins used for packing or storing things in a garage. He pressed the lid shut, sealed it, and just like that, the neighborhood faded away. The world Kara had known, routine, predictable, safe, fell silent. Inside that bin, in the dark, she could barely move. Her body twisted into itself, breath shallow, heart hammering in her chest. Every sound was muffled, every second slowed, but she wasn't panicking. Not yet. Instead, she was thinking, measuring, listening. Kara didn't know yet where she was going, or who he was, or what he wanted. But something inside her stayed sharp, a calm that didn't come from denial, but from decision. She wasn't going to give up, even then, even in the dark, even as the car pulled away from the curb and into the silence of the neighborhood. This is only the beginning of what Kara Robinson endured, and ultimately escaped. In the chapters to come, we'll follow her through the hours she spent inside that house, the calculations she made, the evidence she quietly collected, and how, when the moment came, she ran. But first, we sit with the beginning, with the weight of a summer day that changed everything, with the quiet strength of a girl whose story did not end in silence, and whose memory would not let him get away. The drive was long. At least, that's how it felt. Curled into the plastic bin in the back of the car, Kara couldn't tell where they were going. The space was too small to move, and every breath felt like it had to be measured. Her body was folded tightly, her knees pressing into her chest, her arms trapped awkwardly at her sides. The lid above her barely shifted. There was no light, no sense of distance. Just the soft, steady vibrations of the road beneath the tires and the muffled noise of the car's engine. She tried not to panic. That instinct, that fight to stay present, kicked in quickly. Kara had always been the kind of person who paid attention. Details stuck in her mind. Faces, numbers, little things. And now, pressed into darkness, her brain was already beginning to catalog everything. How long had it been? 10 minutes? 20? She couldn't be sure, but she tried to track the turns. Left, then right, slowing down, speeding up. She listened to the change in pavement, the sound of the tires shifting as the vehicle moved from smooth roads to rougher ones. At some point, she heard what might have been a highway, then quieter streets again. He didn't speak during the drive. She couldn't see him, couldn't move enough to get a glimpse. But she knew he was calm, the kind of calm that didn't need to rush. That didn't second guess. It was eerie how quiet he was, no yelling, no chaos, just a kind of chilling control. And when the car finally stopped, the silence deepened. Kara heard the door open. Footsteps. Then the bin shifted. She felt it being lifted, her body still inside, carried awkwardly but quickly. Through a door, across a threshold. The air changed. It felt cooler, dimmer. A house. He set the bin down. The lid came off, and she was inside his home. The man stood above her, still holding the gun. His expression didn't change. He gave short commands, told her to be quiet, to follow, to move slowly. And she did. She had to. He led her into a bedroom, a typical suburban room, nothing strange or disheveled at first glance. There was a bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a clock. That clock would become important later. Everything in the room was clean, orderly. Nothing about it screamed danger at first. If anything, it was unnervingly plain. He told her to sit. Then, calmly, he restrained her. Not violently, just methodically, as if he'd done it before, as if he knew exactly how to do it. He talked to her in a soft voice, almost casual, asked her questions, told her things. He wanted her to believe she'd be okay if she just followed his instructions. Kara didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She listened, responded when necessary, and more than that, she remembered. Every word, every object in the room, the clock on the nightstand, the kind of shampoo in the shower, the names on prescription bottles in the bathroom. She noticed everything, because deep down, she was already preparing, not just to survive, but to escape. The hours passed slowly. He left the room sometimes. When he did, Kara took mental snapshots of everything. There were signs that someone else lived in the house, another room, with stuffed animals. Children's books. Maybe a kid, but no one else was home. Not that day. Just her. And him. And the slow ticking of time inside the house. Kara stayed quiet, composed. She tried not to let fear take over. It would have been so easy to collapse under the weight of what was happening. But she knew that panic would not help her. Not now. She needed to stay awake. She needed to stay sharp. And above all, she needed to survive long enough for a chance. He brought her food, gave her water. He asked her about her life, tried to normalize the situation in small, grotesque ways. Kara responded carefully, not giving too much, not sounding afraid, just enough to keep him talking, just enough to avoid triggering him. It was a strange, quiet battle, not fought with violence, but with strategy, and Kara was playing to win. Later, as dusk began to fall, he gave her sleeping pills, told her to take them. She swallowed them, but only partway. She tucked the rest in her cheek, then spat them out when he wasn't looking. He never knew. That night he fell asleep, and Kara didn't. She lay awake, watching the clock, tracing every detail in the room, committing everything to memory. The brands on the toiletries, the color of the curtains, the wallpaper pattern, anything that might matter later, anything she could use. She was still waiting, still watching, still thinking. She didn't know when her chance would come, but she knew she would be ready. And when it came, it would happen quickly. She just had to make it through the night. And she did. When morning came, the light through the window shifted slightly. She could hear birds outside, the quiet noise of the neighborhood waking up again. It was almost time. He left the room for a few minutes. And in those minutes, everything changed. But that's for the next chapter. For now, the most important part of this night is not the fear Kara felt, but the clarity she held on to. In a stranger's house, under threat, alone, she kept track of every moment. She stayed awake, and she remembered everything. The morning light was pale, stretching across the quiet floor of the bedroom where Kara had spent the night. Outside the windows, the world had moved on without knowing she was missing. The hum of distant traffic, a lawnmower starting up a few houses away, birds calling from trees. It was the kind of morning that gave no indication that anything terrible had happened at all. Inside, she was still pretending to sleep. She heard him moving through the house. The sounds were ordinary, drawers opening, the clink of something in the kitchen, water running. But to Kara, every sound mattered. Every step, every movement. She was timing him, watching the rhythm of his behavior. And when he came back into the room, his expression hadn't changed. There was something unsettling about how normal he tried to act. He spoke to her softly, not apologetic, not angry, as if this were something that simply was like he didn't see her as a person, but rather as part of a plan. She answered his questions quietly, just as she had before. Calm, cooperative, measured. He never knew she hadn't taken the pills. He believed she'd slept through the night, that she wasn't watching, that she wasn't planning. Later that morning, as the hours slipped by, he left the room again. Not for long, but long enough. And Kara knew. This was it. She moved quietly, carefully, and quickly. She had memorized the layout of the house during the moments he'd left the door open. She knew where the front door was. She knew which hallway led where. Every second of calm she'd shown the night before had been building toward this. She ran, down the hallway, past the living room, toward the front door. She didn't stop to look behind her. She didn't hesitate. When she threw the door open, daylight exploded in front of her. The kind of light that felt like salvation. She bolted, barefoot, sprinting down the street of an unfamiliar neighborhood. No screaming, just movement, just escape. She didn't know where she was, but she knew she had to keep going. She saw two men working in a yard nearby. Landscapers. They looked up, startled, as Kara ran toward them. Her voice was clear, direct. She said she'd been kidnapped. She needed help. They didn't hesitate. One of them ran toward her, the other toward the house. But Kara stopped him. "He's got a gun," she said. And they listened. They brought her into their truck, locked the doors, called 911. She was safe, not just because she'd escaped, but because she had remembered everything. Inside that truck, while they waited for police, Kara gave them the address. She hadn't just noticed the details, she had committed them to memory. The layout of the home, the medicine bottles on the counter with names and pharmacy information, the time on the nightstand clock, the placement of furniture, even the feel of the neighborhood, the way it turned in on itself, the sound of the roads outside. Everything she saw, she remembered, and now she gave it all to them. The 911 call came through just after 11 a.m. By the time law enforcement arrived, Kara had already told them everything they needed to know. She didn't need time to calm down. She didn't ask for water or a blanket or silence. She asked for a pen, and she began to write down everything she'd seen. It took hours to process what she was telling them, not just because of the detail, but because of how rare it was. She hadn't just escaped. She had brought them a blueprint, an entire investigative roadmap. By that evening, the house had been located. But the man, her abductor, was gone. He had vanished in the short hours since she escaped, slipped away in a different vehicle. The home was empty now. No sign of him, but his identity didn't stay hidden for long. Because Kara had remembered more than just what the house looked like. She remembered his name. She had seen it on the pill bottles, on paperwork. She had overheard it when he made a phone call. And she told them, Richard Evonitz, 38 years old, a man who had lived in that neighborhood for years. Polite, clean-cut, quiet, no criminal record on paper that stood out. But behind the doors of that house, he had lived a life that was beginning to unravel. The pieces were coming into view. Law enforcement began to dig into his past. His home, now empty, gave up its secrets slowly. Files, photos, newspaper clippings, storage containers tucked away in closets and corners. And then they found the Polaroids. Dozens of them. Girls. Teenagers. Some smiling, some clearly taken without permission. Some that appeared staged. Others that felt darker, harder to look at. The photos weren't labeled, but they spoke volumes. And one thing was clear. Kara hadn't been the first, and she had been his last. That night, as the sun set over Columbia, Kara Robinson sat in a police station, calm and focused, answering every question, walking investigators through every step of what had happened to her. Not just with clarity, with purpose. She wasn't just telling a story. She was helping build a case. She was, without exaggeration, the reason they were going to find him. But the man she had escaped from was already moving, already running. By the time his name was on the news, he was 2 states away. And what investigators would learn in the days ahead would take this case from an abduction to something much bigger. The search for Richard Evonitz began before the sun had fully set on that same day. By the time law enforcement confirmed his name and identity, thanks to the details Kara had given them, Evonitz was already gone. He had left his home hours earlier, driving away in a gold Dodge Intrepid, taking with him only what he needed to disappear quickly. A small duffel bag, identification, a weapon, and silence. The house he left behind was carefully locked. But inside, investigators were uncovering something more than just a kidnapping case. Room by room, they sifted through his belongings. Nothing in the home looked out of place at first glance. The furniture was neat. The kitchen was clean. The lawn was mowed. It looked like any other house in the quiet neighborhood. But once they opened the bedroom closet, they found a heavy plastic container that told a different story. It was filled with trophies, personal items, notes, photos, and something more unsettling, locks of hair labeled and preserved. There were handwritten pages, ramblings, fantasies, dates. Some were coherent, others were fragmented. The boxes in the storage room had carefully labeled files, most of them related to young girls. The drawers of the bedroom held items that didn't belong to any adult woman. Jewelry, hair ties, socks, and tucked in the back of one drawer, maps. Highlighted, marked, some local, some from other states. It didn't take long for investigators to realize Kara's escape had not only saved her own life, it had pulled back the curtain on something deeper, something older. Richard Evonitz wasn't new to this. He had done it before, and he had likely done worse. As the contents of his home were logged and cataloged, the FBI was brought in. A nationwide bulletin was issued. His photograph was broadcast across television screens and pinned to bulletin boards in police stations from South Carolina to Florida. He was armed, dangerous, and experienced. Meanwhile, Kara remained steady. Still at the police station, she continued to walk investigators through everything. She described the house layout down to the placement of vents and where the creaking floorboards were. She described his speech patterns, the way he moved, the way he folded and unfolded his hands when he was thinking. She had noticed everything. One of the detectives later said that Kara Robinson was unlike any victim they had ever interviewed, not because of what she endured, but because of how she responded. She didn't just want to tell them what happened. She wanted to help catch him. The information she provided led to a broader investigation into Evonitz's background. He had served in the Navy, worked as a pipe fitter, lived in Virginia for several years before moving to South Carolina. No criminal record that raised any alarms. No neighbors who suspected anything unusual. He had a wife, now separated, and a quiet demeanor that kept him largely unnoticed. But as they traced his previous addresses, patterns began to emerge. In Spotsylvania County, Virginia, a familiar unease began to surface in law enforcement circles. 3 names, 3 girls, all missing, all taken years before. Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk, Katie Lisk, all middle school aged, all from the same area, all abducted within an 11-month period in 1996 and 1997. Sophia had been taken first from her front yard. Kristen and Katie had disappeared together while walking home from a community pool. Their bodies were found later, weeks apart, discarded in remote rivers wrapped in sheets weighed down. For years, the cases had gone cold. But now, with Kara's escape, investigators began connecting the dots. The photographs in Evonitz's home, the journals, the pattern of his movements, and the most chilling connection of all, his former residence in Virginia was less than a mile from the Lisk home. The possibility that he was responsible had not been confirmed, but the timeline fit, the methods fit, and the evidence was beginning to line up. As the manhunt intensified, Evonitz was already hundreds of miles away. He had driven through Georgia and into Florida. He shaved his beard, changed his clothing, rented a motel room under a different name. But something had changed in him. For years, he had operated in silence. Quiet, calculated, unseen. But now he was being hunted. His name was on the news. His photo everywhere. The anonymity he had relied on for so long was gone. He called his sister in Jacksonville. Not once, but several times. Rambling voicemails. Disjointed. Emotional. He said he'd made mistakes. He didn't say what they were. He talked about taking his own life. He told her he was sorry. He didn't tell her where he was. Eventually, he made one final call. To his sister again. But this time, she stayed on the line and flagged police. By then, he was in Sarasota, parked in a lot near a shopping plaza. Still in the gold Dodge Intrepid. Local law enforcement closed in carefully. Plainclothes officers positioned their vehicles around him. There was no siren, no standoff, just a quiet containment. But he knew. He saw them in the mirrors. He recognized the movements. And before they could reach him, he picked up the gun. A single shot. By the time the officers reached the car, he was gone. Richard Evonitz died by suicide on June 27, 2002, 3 days after Kara Robinson escaped. The case didn't end there. In many ways, it was only beginning, because now investigators had to go back, to piece together his past, to re-examine cold cases, to identify girls in old photographs, to trace the full scope of what he had done, and for how long. And at the center of it all, one voice kept guiding them forward. Not a profiler, not a detective, a 15-year-old girl who had remembered everything, and who had made sure he would never take anyone else again. When Richard Evonitz died in that Florida parking lot, the manhunt ended. But for investigators, a different kind of work was just beginning. In South Carolina, Kara Robinson had returned home. She was safe now, physically, but everything around her had changed. The quiet routines of suburban summer no longer felt simple. The bike ride to a friend's house, the warmth of the morning sun, the trust she had in the world around her. Those things didn't come back easily. Still, Kara remained composed. In interviews, officers noted her clarity, how she answered every question with care. No dramatics, no hesitation. She was still just 15, but something about her presence made people pause. She had survived something unimaginable. And yet she moved through the aftermath like someone who knew what she wanted. To help, to prevent this from happening again, and to make sure people understood what had really happened. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, law enforcement had begun opening boxes they hadn't looked at in years. In Virginia, detectives working cold cases took a fresh look at 3 files that had haunted them for nearly half a decade. Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk, Katie Lisk. The girls had disappeared in 1996 and 1997. At the time, their abductions had sparked large-scale searches. The public outcry was immediate. Billboards, flyers, school vigils. Whole communities had come together. then waited for answers that never came. Until now. The more investigators learned about Richard Evonitz, the more the timelines lined up. In 1996, he had been living just minutes from the Silva and Lisk homes. He had a job that kept him mobile. He traveled for work often, sometimes gone for days. No one had ever suspected him. He had no arrest record for anything serious. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, invisible in the way predators sometimes are. But his personal life told a different story. His marriage had been strained. There were reports, quiet ones, of controlling behavior, of secrecy. He spent long hours in the garage, often left town without explaining why. He also had a habit of collecting things. Police found his storage habits unsettling. Everything had a label. Boxes filled with mementos, newspaper articles, lists, and handwritten notes. Some were coded. Others were just fragments, pages of names, clothing sizes, hair colors. Among them, they found a small bundle of newspaper clippings, all about the 3 missing girls from Virginia, the way they had vanished, the way the bodies were found, the interviews with family. He had saved it all. And more than that, he had written notes on them. Tiny pencil marks in the margins, details that hadn't been public. Dates and phrases that matched internal case notes from law enforcement. It was enough. In Spotsylvania County, Virginia, prosecutors quietly began preparing a file. There would be no trial, no confession, but in the eyes of those who had worked the cases for years, the truth was finally becoming clear. Richard Evonitz had been the man they were looking for. The similarities between Kara's abduction and the earlier crimes were too precise to ignore. The method of control, the attention to detail, the use of restraint, the way he isolated his victims, everything echoed the past. But Kara had escaped, and that changed everything. For the families of Sophia, Kristen, and Katie, the news arrived slowly. Carefully, investigators reached out to them one by one, sharing the evidence, the connections, the path that had led them from South Carolina to Virginia. It wasn't the kind of closure anyone dreams of, but it was something. A name, a face, a clear link to someone who could no longer hurt anyone else. For Kara, the days after Evonitz's death were filled with conversations. Victim advocates, detectives, journalists, and slowly, the realization that her story had stopped one of the country's most elusive predators. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't seek attention. But she understood even then that something had shifted. That her actions, the things she remembered, the decisions she made while being held captive, had created a path for justice not just for herself, but for girls who had never made it home. And she carried that truth carefully. Not loudly, but with purpose. As summer stretched into July, the investigation continued. Every day brought new pieces of information. Even its movements, his jobs, the towns where he had briefly lived or passed through. Old cases were reopened. Tips came in from across the southeast. Survivors of attempted abductions reached out, sharing details that now made sense in hindsight. Law enforcement mapped his routes. They tracked down former co-workers, neighbors. They looked through old hotel receipts and gas station logs. They reviewed school records near his former homes. The trail he had left behind was long and messy, but it had been hidden until Kara pulled it into the light. There were no guarantees that every answer would be found. Not every photograph in his possession could be identified. Not every name scribbled in his notebooks led to a known case. Some pieces would remain unresolved. But what mattered most was that the silence had broken. Because Kara had chosen to remember. Because she had run. Because she had survived. And that survival had done more than protect her. It had exposed a pattern that otherwise might never have been seen. That truth began to ripple outward. To investigators. To families. To the public. And eventually, to Kara herself. She had stopped something terrible. But in doing so, she had stepped into something else. An understanding that her life had changed in a way that could never fully be reversed. And in the chapters to come, that change would begin to take shape. Not in headlines, not in interviews, but in the quiet decisions she made afterward, and in the long, slow process of learning to live again. The news faded slowly, the way it always does. After the initial storm, headlines, press conferences, evening broadcasts, there was quiet. Richard Evonitz's name stopped appearing on television. The bulletins came down from post office walls. The reporters moved on. For most of the country, it was over. But for Kara, everything was still shifting. In those weeks after her escape, the world around her looked the same, but it no longer felt familiar. The house she had grown up in hadn't changed. Her bike was still leaning against the garage wall. Her room, with its posters and notebooks and reminders of who she was before, was waiting for her. But stepping back into that life wasn't easy. Trauma doesn't arrive all at once. It lingers. It waits. It shows up in the pauses, when someone shuts a door too quickly, or when a stranger walks too close, or when the phone rings late at night. Kara didn't talk about nightmares, but they were there. She didn't talk about the startle reflex, but her mother saw it. Still, she didn't fall apart. She processed in silence, often alone. She was used to being strong, used to holding things in place. And now, with the weight of what she had survived pressing down on her, she continued to function. But the pressure never truly left. People approached her differently now. Some with awe, some with discomfort. Even her classmates didn't know what to say. Teachers looked at her like she might break. Friends asked careful questions, or didn't ask at all. She had become, without choosing to, the girl who escaped. And everyone knew. What most people didn't realize was how much had gone into that escape. Not just courage, but calculation. The countless mental notes. The split-second decisions. The ability to remain calm while facing something that could have easily overwhelmed her. Kara had seen what very few people ever see, and come back. But coming back wasn't the same as moving on. The investigators continued to call. There were more interviews, more questions. She was asked to revisit the layout of the house, to identify photos, to describe his voice again and again. She never refused. But each conversation brought her back to that room, to those hours. She stayed steady, but it took its toll. She began seeing a counselor. Quietly, away from school. Someone to speak to without judgment, without the burden of expectation. In that room, she was not being interviewed. She was not being admired. She was not being asked to be brave. She was just Kara, and she was exhausted. But even in that exhaustion, a new thought began to form. One that she wouldn't share aloud for some time. The idea that maybe she could do something with what had happened. Not just carry it, but use it. As the investigation into Richard Evonitz's past continued, authorities grew more certain that Kara's case had not been isolated. More links to Virginia were found. More timelines matched up. But there was also something more complicated. The number of cases that didn't match, that might be connected, that hovered in uncertainty. There were unsolved disappearances in other states. Missing persons cases from towns he had briefly lived in or passed through. None of them confirmed, but none of them fully ruled out either. And because of Kara, those cases had been reopened. That part stayed with her. Even though she had no obligation to speak to the press, Kara agreed to one interview later that year. It was short, measured, and mostly focused on her appreciation for law enforcement. But one line stood out, softly said but deeply honest. "I think he's done this before." It wasn't a guess. It was a knowing. She had felt it in his behavior. The preparation, the calm, the lack of hesitation. This hadn't been an impulsive crime. It had been practiced. At night, Kara sometimes stayed awake longer than she meant to. Not from fear, necessarily, but from awareness. She knew too much now. She knew how quickly something could change, how close violence could be to ordinary life, how someone who seemed harmless could hide something terrible. And slowly, those realizations began to shape her choices. She became interested in psychology, in criminal behavior, in understanding, not why someone like Evonitz did what he did, but how people survived it, how they processed it, how they lived beyond it. She didn't want to live in fear. She wanted to understand the mechanisms that made survival possible. In the fall, she returned to school. There were stares, whispers, but also quiet admiration. Students who didn't know her well before now sat beside her at lunch. Teachers gave her space but also leaned in to check on her. She navigated it all with grace, though privately she wished to be invisible again. But that wasn't possible. And maybe she thought that wasn't what she needed anymore. She had seen what could happen in the worst of circumstances. And now, in classrooms and hallways and after-school activities, she saw what it meant to rebuild a sense of safety. It didn't come all at once, but it came, and it started with choice. Her choice. To keep showing up, to keep speaking when it mattered, to let herself slowly reclaim the space that had been taken, and to think, even in quiet moments, about what it might mean to one day help others do the same. She didn't yet know what that would look like, but it was beginning, a new thread in her life, woven slowly, deliberately, patiently, just like everything she'd done since the moment she ran. The morning of June 24th, 2002, had started without warning. There was no build-up, no creeping sense of danger, just a humid summer morning in Columbia, South Carolina. Kara had agreed to water the plants. It was an errand so small, so harmless, that no one thought to question it. She had tied her hair back, slipped on her shoes, and ridden her bike to her best friend's house. The neighborhood was familiar. The houses sat close together, driveways clean, hedges trimmed. This was a place where trouble didn't knock on doors. But it didn't need to knock. It waited. The man who approached Kara that morning didn't look dangerous. He was calm, dressed in a polo shirt and jeans. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He held a few pamphlets in his hand and said he was passing out information about a local church. Would she take one? He said he had more in the car, just over there. It would only take a moment. The car, a green Pontiac Firebird, was parked a few feet away. There was no panic in his voice, no alarm in his posture. Everything about him was measured. So Kara stepped toward the car. That moment, measured in seconds, marked the line between before and after. He opened the door and leaned inside. She stepped closer, and then everything changed. With a speed that betrayed all his calm, he turned and pressed a handgun against her neck. Get in the car. There was no time to argue, no time to run. He forced her into a large plastic storage bin already waiting in the back seat. One of the wide-lipped containers meant for tools or winter clothes. She curled into it, and he shut the lid. Darkness. Kara could barely breathe. The air inside was stale. The lid sealed tightly. Her body folded tightly inside, unable to shift or stretch. Her chest pressed against her knees. Her heart hammered. The car pulled away. She didn't scream. Instead, she listened. The sounds of the car's engine, the shift of gears, the texture of the road beneath the tires. She tried to count the turns, tried to hold on to the seconds, anything to give her a sense of time, of distance, of direction. She stayed awake. They drove for what felt like a long time. In reality, it was about 10 miles. The car stopped. She felt the bin being lifted, carried. The change in temperature as they moved indoors. Carpet beneath his shoes. A door closing behind them. He placed the bin on the floor and opened the lid. Light. Air. His face now clearer. He pulled her out, told her to follow him. Still holding the gun, he led her to a bedroom. She saw a bed, a nightstand, a lamp, a clock. She noticed everything. He tied her hands. Not cruelly, not violently, just methodically, as if he'd done it before. Then he began speaking. He asked her questions. Where she lived, who she was visiting, what her parents did for work. His voice was calm, almost conversational. But Kara understood the danger wasn't in what he said. It was in how he said it. There was no hesitation in his movements, no nerves in his speech. He had done this before. She was sure of it. Over the next few hours, he came and went from the room, sometimes bringing food, sometimes saying nothing at all. When he spoke, it was as if he was trying to create normalcy, something that Kara knew was carefully constructed. An illusion meant to confuse her, to make her believe that if she cooperated, she'd be let go. But she didn't believe it, not for a second, and so she watched. She remembered the name on his medicine bottles, Evonitz, the shampoo in his shower, the layout of the home, the noises from the street outside, even the pattern on the wallpaper. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stayed alert. When he offered her sleeping pills that evening, she pretended to swallow them, hiding them in her cheek until he left the room. She spat them out later, unnoticed. By morning, she was still awake, and he had let his guard down. He left her alone for only a few minutes. But that's all she needed. She ran, out the front door, into the sunlight, across the quiet neighborhood she didn't recognize, until she saw two landscapers working in a nearby yard. She didn't wait. She told them, "I was kidnapped." They brought her into their truck, locked the doors, called 911, and she never looked back. Kara Robinson was held captive for less than 24 hours. But in that time, she gathered enough information to identify her abductor, lead police to his home, and unknowingly connect him to a string of unsolved murders from years before. There was no violent escape, no chase, just a girl who stayed calm, who paid attention, and who waited for the moment she could act. Her story is rare, not because of what happened to her, but because of how she responded. The crime itself lasted only a single day, but its impact would ripple across states, reopen cold cases, and ultimately stop a predator whose crimes had gone unnoticed for years. And Kara never let fear silence her. She remembered everything, and that changed everything. The investigation moved quickly in the hours after Kara Robinson escaped. Her composure, her memory, the calm way she explained what had happened, it all gave law enforcement a roadmap. In most cases like this, detectives begin with very little. A name if they're lucky, maybe a partial license plate, a vague description. Kara gave them everything. His name, Richard Evonitz. The color and model of the car, green Pontiac Firebird. The layout of the house, the front door, the bedroom, the bathroom. Personal items in plain sight. Prescription bottles with his name, a clock radio that read 3:24 p.m., a framed photo in the hallway. Even the sounds outside the house. A nearby road, traffic during certain hours, the pitch of a dog barking somewhere close by. All of it she remembered. Detectives in Colombia quickly located the house. Her descriptions were exact, down to the wallpaper pattern and the position of furniture in each room. When they entered the residence, they found it just as she'd said. Only one thing was missing: Richard Evonitz. By the time officers crossed the threshold, he had already fled. A second car, a gold Dodge Intrepid, was gone from the driveway. He had packed quickly, left behind nearly everything but the essentials. A bag, a handgun, identification, and he was gone. That's when the FBI stepped in. With the immediate threat over and Kara safe, the scope of the case began to widen. Federal agents coordinated with local law enforcement in both South Carolina and Virginia. The details Kara had provided, especially the full name, gave them access to his background almost instantly. They learned about his Navy service, his work as a pipe fitter, his previously clean criminal record, and they found his former address in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. That name, Spotsylvania, stirred something familiar in more than one law enforcement office. Because back in 1996 and 1997, 3 girls had disappeared from that same county, all under similar circumstances. Sophia Silva, age 16, vanished from her front yard while doing homework. Kristen and Katie Lisk, sisters, ages 15 and 12, disappeared together walking home from the pool. All were found later, their bodies discovered in water. All 3 had been taken suddenly, without witnesses, in broad daylight. The cases had gone cold. No viable suspects. No convictions. Just grief, and a deep wound in the small Virginia community that never quite closed. But now, with a name and a new case, those old files were pulled from storage. And when investigators laid them side by side with what had happened to Kara, something clicked. The method, the preparation, the calm control, the evidence left behind, and the way he vanished afterward. It wasn't a new pattern. It was an old one. In Jacksonville, Florida, Richard Evonitz was already on the move. He called his sister more than once, left voicemails that were strange and rambling. Not apologetic, just fragmented. He said things like, "I've made a mess, and they're going to find me." He never mentioned Kara's name. never admitted to anything directly. But his tone had changed. He knew it was over. In one call, he talked about ending his life. His sister, unsure what to do, tried to keep him on the line. Eventually, she called the police. By then, he was in Sarasota, parked near a shopping plaza. Law enforcement moved carefully. No sirens, no bright lights. Plainclothes officers surrounded the lot. They approached slowly to avoid escalation. But Evonitz saw them. He reached for the handgun in the passenger seat. One shot. It was over. The man who had taken Kara Robinson, and who police now strongly suspected had taken the lives of 3 other young girls, was gone. He would never face trial. He would never speak for himself. There would be no confession. But that didn't mean the story ended there. Back in Virginia, detectives worked around the clock. They searched his former home. They re-examined old physical evidence. Tiny fibers, hairs, traces from the Lisk and Silva cases that had been preserved in sealed envelopes for years. And now, with Evonitz's name on the file, they ran it all again. This time with new technology. A partial DNA profile was recovered from the Lisk sisters' case. It was enough. It matched Evonitz. It was the confirmation they needed. They couldn't ask him questions. But they didn't have to. Kara's escape had led them to him. And the evidence confirmed it. Evonitz had been the one. The man who had haunted Virginia for years. The man no one had ever suspected. Had quietly moved to South Carolina and continued living his life. Undetected, unbothered, until he chose the wrong girl. Publicly, the confirmation came in waves. First, local media in Virginia released the update. A connection between the Robinson case and the Lisk-Silva disappearances. Then the national outlets followed. The story was no longer just about Kara Robinson's escape. It was about a serial offender who had operated in silence for years, and who had finally been stopped, not by an arrest, not by a team of investigators, but by the one girl who refused to stay silent, by someone who hadn't let fear overwhelm her, by someone who ran, remembered, and spoke. Law enforcement officials called Kara a hero. She didn't agree with the word, but she understood the weight of what she had done, and the names of Sophia, Kristen, and Katie stayed with her. She never met them, but she had seen what he was capable of. She had seen what he had prepared, and she had escaped the future they never got the chance to. Their stories, like hers, had been interrupted, but hers was the one that gave theirs an ending, and for investigators it was clear. Without Kara, Richard Evonitz would never have been found. The confirmation came quietly. There was no press conference filled with dramatic statements. No national special aired in prime time. Just a set of words spoken carefully by law enforcement officials in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. DNA evidence had matched Richard Evonitz to the unsolved murders of Kristen and Katie Lisk. And while the DNA from Sophia Silva's case had degraded over time, the method, the geography, and the behavioral patterns left behind formed a line of connection that was, in the minds of investigators, undeniable. It was enough to close the cases. But closing a case isn't the same as closing a wound. For the Lisk and Silva families, it had been more than 5 years since their daughters were taken. 5 years of silence, of rumors, of leads that went nowhere. 5 years of holding on to hope and facing the weight of every day without answers. Now the answer had come, but it came without the chance to ask questions, without the opportunity to face the man who had taken them. And it came only because Kara Robinson had escaped. The public learned more about her in the following weeks. Not through interviews. Kara didn't speak publicly, not in any long-form way, but through the words of law enforcement officers and detectives who described her with quiet admiration. She had remained calm under pressure, had memorized names, labels, addresses, had waited for the right moment to flee, had escaped not by luck but by strategy. And because of her, a thread had finally been tied between seemingly isolated crimes in 2 different states. At just 15 years old, Kara had become a central figure in one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in recent memory. She didn't seek that role, but she didn't walk away from it either. Inside law enforcement circles, the story of Kara's escape began to circulate as a training example. Not just for how she escaped, but for how she handled the aftermath. Officers and trauma specialists began to discuss how rare it was to have such detailed recall from a victim so young, and how essential it had been. Her case became a quiet study in survival. Psychologists and victim advocates noted her composure, the way she processed what had happened. There was no scripted behavior, no need to present a certain face to the world. She was simply present, honest, alert, and unwavering in the moments that mattered most. It gave rise to questions that were often uncomfortable. How had she known what to do? Where did that clarity come from? The truth was there was no single answer. Kara had always been observant. She had always paid attention to detail. She had always carried a kind of internal steadiness. But none of that predicted how someone would act in the face of trauma. No one knew, not even her, how she would respond until it happened. And when it did, she survived it in the only way she knew how. By staying awake, by staying aware, by staying human, even when everything around her tried to take that away. As summer gave way to fall, the investigators stepped back. The evidence had been processed. The case files were reorganized, notes rewritten. In Virginia, the Lisk and Silva families were left to grieve again, but this time with names, with a sense of finality they hadn't had before. In South Carolina, Kara returned to her life. Or something like it. She went back to school. Quiet halls, routine lessons, lockers closing, pencils tapping against desks. Her classmates still didn't always know what to say. Most of them never asked. But they looked at her differently. Not with pity, with respect. Teachers gave her space, but also asked questions when needed. Friends were careful. At times too careful. It was as though they were afraid to disturb something delicate. But Kara didn't feel delicate. She felt sharpened. Not by anger, not by fear, but by truth. She had seen something few ever see and come back with clarity, not just about what had happened, but about what she wanted to do next. Even then, the thought was already forming in the background, that she could help other people who had been through something. Not by telling her story again and again, but by being present, by listening, by doing the slow, quiet work of showing up. Over time, the national spotlight moved elsewhere. But law enforcement never forgot. In classrooms, in conference rooms, in field offices, Kara's case remained a point of learning. And for a small group of families in Virginia, her actions had closed a chapter that had remained painfully open for too long. Because of her, there would be no more victims of Richard Evonitz. And because of her, 3 young girls who had once been names on missing posters were now tied to the truth. That matters. It doesn't erase what happened, but it gives shape to something that otherwise might have stayed in the dark. And in the middle of it all stood a teenager who never intended to become part of a story, but did, and changed its ending. In the weeks after the case closed, Kara Robinson found herself at the center of a story that never felt like hers. People used words like brave, resilient, hero. They weren't wrong, but none of it captured what the experience had really been, what it meant to survive something that tried to take your identity from you, and then return to a world that didn't know how to respond. What Kara wanted most in those early weeks was not to be celebrated. She wanted normalcy, to walk through the school hallway without the second glances, to sit at lunch and talk about unimportant things, to have a moment where everything wasn't shadowed by what had happened in that house. But things had shifted. She knew that. And as much as she craved the quiet she once took for granted, Kara also understood that the spotlight around her wasn't about her, exactly. It was about what she represented. She had done something rare, escaped from a captor who had never lost control of a victim before. And she had not only escaped, she had dismantled the silence he had relied on for years. That silence didn't just exist inside Evonitz's house. It lived in the gaps between missing persons reports. It hovered in the communities where girls had vanished and no one had seen what happened. It echoed through police stations and family living rooms and cold case files. And Kara had shattered it. Not loudly, not with headlines, but with memory, with presence, with persistence. As law enforcement wrapped up their internal reports, as prosecutors archived the files they now considered closed, the impact of the case quietly expanded. Kara's name appeared in more internal law enforcement training materials, not as a case study in trauma, but in witness reliability, in situational awareness, in post-crisis decision-making. It was rare, they said, to find someone who could provide so many actionable details in the hours immediately following an abduction. She hadn't just remembered the street name. She had noticed the medicine bottles, the route taken, the placement of rooms, the sound of traffic outside. And then there was the moment she ran. She didn't wait. She didn't freeze. She didn't plead. She moved. And because she did, Richard Evonitz was exposed before he could act again. In the public sphere, news of the case slowly drifted into the background. True crime outlets ran short segments. Kara's name was mentioned on message boards, in articles, and in online forums where people compared timelines and discussed the psychology of serial offenders. But Kara herself withdrew. She declined interviews. She turned down offers from media outlets. She didn't want to tell her story that way, not while it was still unfolding inside her. Instead, she focused on her life, her friendships, her future. She went to counseling, spoke to trauma professionals, read books about psychology, criminal behavior, and resilience, not out of morbid curiosity, but from a quiet hunger to understand what she had seen and why it happened. She studied how the mind responds under stress, how the brain protects itself, why some people freeze and others fight, why survival isn't always about strength, but about timing, awareness, and instinct. The things she had done intuitively, she now wanted to understand deliberately, not for closure, for purpose. In South Carolina, the story lingered in subtle ways. Teachers at her school became more alert. Local parents became more cautious. Police departments in nearby towns quietly reviewed their own cold cases. There was no panic, just a deeper awareness of how something so dangerous could hide in plain sight. For the Lisk and Silva families in Virginia, the finality was bittersweet. There would be no trial, no courtroom, no answers from the man who took their daughters. But there was at last a name, and proof, and the assurance that he was gone, and that, by a margin of seconds, Kara Robinson had survived what their daughters did not. The contrast was painful, and yet it gave shape to their grief. Their daughters had not been forgotten. Their cases had not been abandoned. They had simply been waiting for someone who could see what no one else had seen. And Kara had been that person. In private moments, Kara wrestled with that truth. She didn't believe her life had been saved for a reason. She didn't believe in grand narratives or cosmic purposes. But she did believe in choice. And every choice she had made during those 20 hours, when to speak, what to remember, when to run, had kept her alive. Now she had a new set of choices. How to carry the story, how to grow from it, whether to speak up, and when. For now, she stayed quiet. But something was building, a quiet intention, that this wouldn't define her, but it would shape her, that the worst thing that had happened to her would not be the final word in her story. It would be the beginning of something else, a new chapter, still unfolding. Years passed quietly. The news cycle had long since moved on. For most, the case that had once stirred headlines was now a memory, a solved crime, a name occasionally referenced in training or interviews, but no longer part of daily conversation. The house where Kara Robinson had been held was sold. The neighborhood, for the most part, went back to its usual rhythms. Mornings with coffee and newspapers, evenings with porch lights and quiet routines. But Kara had not returned to the same life. She had built a new one. It hadn't happened suddenly. There was no single turning point. Healing had arrived in fragments, in therapy sessions, in long drives, in conversations with people who didn't look at her as a symbol, but as a person. The work was slow. Some days it sat heavily on her shoulders. Other days it drifted further behind her. She graduated high school, attended college, chose a path in psychology and law enforcement, not because of what had happened to her, but because of how she had learned to think in its aftermath. There was power in understanding what people do under pressure, what they remember, what they need in the worst moments of their lives. She didn't chase the spotlight, but eventually she allowed herself to speak, not to relive the trauma, but to offer insight. Her first few talks were small, closed settings, classrooms, police academies, victim advocacy conferences. She didn't tell her story for effect. She didn't linger on the horror. She simply walked through what had happened and what had helped her survive it. What mattered most, she often said, were the little things. A calm officer, a moment of control, the space to breathe, the freedom to speak without being doubted, the understanding that trauma looks different in every person, and that no one reacts the right way. By her mid-20s, Kara had become a voice in spaces that didn't usually include survivors. She consulted on trauma-informed training, helped develop approaches for interviewing victims without re-traumatization, shared her experience in a way that made professionals listen without judgment. Her name wasn't always attached to big headlines anymore, but inside law enforcement circles and among survivor networks, it quietly carried weight. She was known not just for what she'd lived through, but for what she chose to do afterward. Outside of the professional world, Kara built a personal life as well, one that had nothing to do with the case. She married, moved, took up new routines. She planted a garden, kept a dog, traveled when she could, laughed without explanation, created a space where the past didn't define the shape of every day. There were still reminders, sometimes small, a certain tone of voice, a news story that struck too close, a scent, a certain kind of silence at night. But those moments didn't control her anymore. They passed like weather, noticeable but no longer destructive, because she had learned how to live alongside the memory, not by erasing it, but by softening it. In Virginia, the families of Kristen and Katie Lisk and Sophia Silva continued to speak their daughters' names. They created foundations, offered scholarships, hosted community events, kept their memories alive, not just as victims, but as bright, funny, creative girls who had once filled their homes with laughter. They never asked Kara to speak for them, but in quiet moments, they told reporters and investigators that they were grateful for her, that they had watched her story unfold with admiration, that her strength had given shape to the closure they'd waited years for. Kara never claimed to speak on behalf of anyone, but she carried the weight of those girls with care. Their names were part of her story now, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. In 2021, nearly 2 decades after her escape, Kara made the decision to share her story publicly, fully, and on her own terms. She began speaking more openly, not about what was done to her, but about how she reclaimed herself afterward. Her goal wasn't to inspire, it was to inform. She talked about trauma and its quiet aftermath, about how recovery is not a straight line, about how survival is not defined by what you did in the moment, but what you choose after. She launched a platform to support other survivors, not with slogans or sentimentality, but with tools, resources, language, space. She didn't tell people to be brave. She told them it was okay to fall apart, that survival looked different for everyone, that it was okay not to be okay, that being quiet was not the same as being weak. And through that honesty, people listened. The woman who had once been a teenage girl in a plastic storage bin, measuring time in breath and heartbeat, now stood in front of rooms filled with people who needed to hear what came next. Not the crime, but the life that came after. Kara never claimed to be special. She simply said this. This happened to me. I survived. And now, here's what I've learned. And that was enough. There's a silence that settles over some stories when the chaos ends. Not an emptiness, but a stillness. What's left after the headlines fade, after the questions are answered, after justice arrives in the only form it can. Kara Robinson lives in that space now, not defined by what happened to her, not erased by it either. She exists beyond the single day that could have ended everything. The story she survived no longer lingers in whispers. It moves steadily through the choices she makes, the work she does, and the way she continues to show up in a world that once tried to take her away from it. She doesn't need to revisit that June morning in 2002 to remember who she is. But she hasn't buried it either. It lives quietly beside her. What happened changed the course of more than just one life. Her escape unraveled a pattern. It named a predator. It connected families who had waited years for truth and provided investigators with the clearest account of how a serial offender operated without detection. But the legacy of that escape doesn't sit in a courtroom or rest in archived case files. It's lived in the calm, unflinching way Kara has navigated the years since. The talks she gives now are not filled with the heavy silence of pain. They carry something else, something steadier. She doesn't dramatize. She doesn't ask for sympathy. She explains, not just how she survived, but why it matters that survival is seen for what it really is, an ongoing act, a daily decision, a refusal to let the worst thing that happened become the only thing people remember. She speaks with the ease of someone who has already done the hardest thing imaginable, and then built a life anyway. Kara's story has changed over time, not in its facts, but in its shape. What was once a crisis has become a reference point. What was once a narrow escape has become the foundation for education, training, and advocacy across the country. She is now seen as a survivor, yes, but also as a professional, a speaker, a mentor, a guide for those just beginning to process their own trauma. She reminds them, always gently, that there is no single right way to move forward, that some days are quiet, some are heavy, that healing is not something you achieve, it's something you carry, and that carrying it doesn't make you broken. It makes you real. In quiet corners of law enforcement, her name still comes up. New recruits hear her story during training, not for its drama, but for its detail. They study the way she remained aware, the things she noticed, the way she handled herself during the investigation. She's not discussed as a victim to be pitted. She's cited as an example of presence, of clarity, of what happens when we listen to the person who lived it instead of speaking over them. And in those spaces, she continues to make an impact long after her case was closed. Years after the abduction, Kara returned, on her own terms, to the neighborhood where she had been taken. The house was no longer the same. The trees had grown taller. The streets were lined with different cars, different families. But something about the stillness remained. She stood near the spot where it had happened. Quiet, not nostalgic, just present. She didn't need to say anything. It wasn't about conquering fear. It wasn't about reclaiming territory. It was just a moment of recognition. This is where I was, and this is who I am now. The story of Kara Robinson does not end in trauma. It does not end in a courtroom. It does not end in grief. It ends in motion, in the slow, steady pace of a life lived fully, even after the worst has happened. A life with ordinary moments, grocery runs, coffee shops, early morning walks. And a few extraordinary ones, stages, microphones, quiet hugs after speaking events, letters from strangers who say, "Because of you, I kept going." This story, in its simplest form, is not about what was done to Kara. It is about what she did next, and what she's still doing. Every day, softly, steadily, without apology, and with her own voice fully her own.